Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this second Changing Planet seminar of the academic year. The title today is going to be More Democracy, Not Less, the Role of Democratic Participation for Climate Action. And the seminar is hosted by the Grantham Institute at Imperial College London. Now, if you'd like to stay up to date with our latest events, join our mailing list to receive newsletters and follow us on social media. You can do so using links which will be posted in the chat later on. Now, my name is Ben. I'm a PhD student here at Imperial, and I will be chairing this afternoon's event. Now, this afternoon, we are very fortunate to be joined by Professor Rebecca Willis. Rebecca is a professor in practice at Lancaster Environment Centre and an expert lead for Climate Assembly UK, the Citizens' Assembly established by the UK Parliament. She holds a UKRI fellowship investigating citizen engagement in energy and climate governance, and is both the trustee of the New Economics Foundation and an advisor to the National Lottery's Climate Action Fund. Now, a little brief background for her talk. Frustrated with the lack of climate action, the veteran climate scientist James Lovelock once said, "It may be necessary to put democracy on hold for a while. Democratic government," he felt, "was standing in the way of a decisive response." But Professor Willis's research suggests the opposite. To tackle the climate crisis, we need more and better democracy, not less. In this talk, Professor Willis will draw from her research with UK members of Parliament, her role as an expert lead for Climate Assembly UK, and her new book, Too Hot to Handle, The Democratic Challenge of Climate Change. She will set out the case for putting citizen engagement at the centre of our climate strategy. Now, we have what I'm sure will be an engaging and thought-provoking discussion coming up. First, Professor Willis will present, and then we'll move on to a Q&A session. Following the Q&A session, anyone who wishes to is very welcome to stay on the call for a more informal chat. Rebecca might be able to stick around for a few more minutes after the end of the Q&A, but Patrick and I, the seminar reps, will be around. And if you want to chat to each other and to us about anything to do with the talk or to do with the seminar series in general, you'd be very welcome to do so. We look forward to that. And just before we begin, I want to go through a few brief housekeeping notes. Please ensure that your audio is muted at all times unless you're called upon during the Q&A session. If you'd like to ask a question after the talk, please let us know by writing in the chat. And you can do that during the talk, and we'll call on you during the Q&A. Please include your name and, if you wish, your affiliation. And if you prefer for me to read out your question rather than delivering it yourself, please specify that as well. And if you need any other assistance during the talk, please put this in the chat and we'll do our best to get to you as quickly as we can. And lastly, please do be aware that this session is being recorded. I think that's quite enough from me for now. So I will pass over to Professor Willis and ask her to begin her talk. Thanks very much for being with us, Professor Willis, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'm really pleased to be at least virtually back at Imperial. I'm missing London. I haven't been to London since March, and normally I'm there sort of every week or every other week. So I'm missing the capital, nice as it is in the Lake District where I live. So you already mentioned, Ben, this, what I think is a really striking quote from James Lovelock, that climate change may be an issue as serious as war, which may require us to put democracy on hold for a while. And when I first read that, he said that about 10 years ago, it crystallized for me what I think is possibly a real problem for the climate community and the way we've thought of climate change so far and climate action. And so Lovelock very helpfully made explicit a problem that I think is implicitly present. Let me explain what that means. I'm going to focus on what the net zero transition means for democracy. And I will talk to you about this amazing experiment that I've been part of this year, Climate Assembly UK. But more generally, what I say is based on the past sort of 20 years of working on climate and energy policy, hence the title Professor in Practice, because I'm sort of straddling that divide between academia and the rest of the world. And as Ben said, a lot of what I've been talking about today is summarised in the book, Too Hot to Handle. So I think what James Lovelock did by saying we may need to put democracy on hold, he articulated in stark terms something that I actually think many in the climate community have felt, that democracy gets in the way of climate action and that experts should be in the driving seat. And this call for experts to be in charge is one that I hear really surprisingly often in the climate community, maybe not as explicitly as Lovelock articulated, but there's a sort of strong sense that those with the knowledge and the evidence should take control. It's what the social scientist Martin Hager calls cockpitism, the illusion that you can steer the planet the way that you fly a plane. So you put all your faith in those two pilots, the pilot and the co-pilot, who are, if you look at, do a Google search for images of pilots in planes, they're almost always white men. But they're there in their cockpit. They have all the information they need. They have a dashboard of gleaming instruments and levers to steer us on the right flight path. And so the idea is that if only we find, the right pilots and the right machine, that we can tackle climate change the same way. And, quite aside from whether we should be using aviation metaphors, I think this is a really dangerous illusion. So let me just get this straight. I'm not for a second saying that expertise is not necessary. So the incredible expertise of climate scientists, of policy experts, of economists, of social scientists, that is absolutely necessary to shape our response to climate, but it's necessary and not sufficient. And I strongly think that we need our climate strategy to be expert informed, but not expert led. And yet this call for expert led decisions is something that I see constantly. And, rather than Lovelock's rather stark statement, they're often instead called things like blueprints, roadmaps, models. They're everywhere. And one, perhaps the most sophisticated example is the proposal for Earth system governance, which has been put forward by a very wide group of mostly natural scientists, but also social scientists, led by Johan Rockström. Now, he's done some really good work. You might well have seen it, summarising a huge amount of scientific work into formulating a set of planetary boundaries, a kind of, we must not transgress these boundaries if we're to maintain the health of the planet. Right, so far so good. That's a really useful communications tool. But he then flips to say that the way that we can keep within planetary boundaries is to establish a system of Earth system governance. And so essentially the job of Earth system governance is to steer the planet so that you operate within those planetary boundaries. And yet I don't see an opposition to democracy in this model, but I see an almost silence about crucial questions like how we bring this Earth system governance, if that's what we want, into being. Who has the authority to decide how our society is managed, how our planet is managed, how we stick to those planetary boundaries, and by what means do those who get the authority earn that legitimacy to make decisions on behalf of the rest of us? If they're the pilots, are we the passengers? Are we just sitting there? Are we passive about this? In short, how as a human society should we debate, agree, and carry out plans to tackle climate change? And that's really, that how question is really missing from a lot of climate scholarship. So what about government? I mean, you might think then that, it's not the job of scientists or academics to do that, but surely that's government's job. That's what they're elected to do, isn't it? But the surprising thing here is that even democratically elected governments have been pretty reluctant to actually talk to people, to have that dialogue about what needs to happen on climate. And I actually think that a seminar that I did at Imperial College probably 3 or 4 years ago was the first time I presented the work that I had done looking at politicians' attitudes to climate change, what they think about it and what kind of action that they support. And that work with politicians showed that what held them back was not a lack of understanding of the science, although that's still an issue, that could still be better, but actually it was social and cultural issues. It was that they felt, and this might have changed a little bit, we can talk about that, they felt that if they spoke out on climate change, that would actually harm their identity as a politician, would affect how people thought of them. They were worried about being called a sort of a freak or a zealot. Those were the words they used. And they also didn't know if they had the support of people. They didn't know whether the kind of climate action that might be needed would have support. And in fact, if you compare what politicians thought against public opinion research, it's pretty clear that politicians have consistently underestimated levels of support for climate policy. So, as a result, I think the dominant approach by government in this country, but also you can see this more broadly, not everywhere, but it's quite common, is what I've tended to start thinking of as climate policy by stealth. So essentially focusing on those things like the decarbonisation of the power sector and industry that can be done without people noticing. So governments have tended to prioritise things that, in their view, will involve as little change to people's lives as possible. And they're hoping that people either won't notice or won't care. And I think this is deeply problematic. I find it morally problematic, but also from a practical perspective, if you look at the changes that are needed in order to reach net zero, you're talking about huge changes to transport, switch to EVs, electric vehicles, and travelling less altogether. If you're looking at the changes needed in people's homes in terms of improving energy efficiency, introducing zero carbon heating, if you're looking at the changes to land use and farming, reduce meat and dairy consumption and so on, people are going to notice those, right? And so the idea that we can somehow sort of sneak these changes through is really problematic to my mind. So what my own research suggests, I think pretty conclusively, is that we need more democracy, more engagement from people. We need to do democracy better rather than having less of it. So before I carry on, I think I need to take what might be called the Trump turn, because here I am sort of, idealistically making the case for more and better democracy. But you may well be thinking, well, 70 million people in the US just voted for a candidate who has time and again denied the science of climate change. And, he didn't win the White House, but still 70 million is a big number to ignore. It's not a good look for my case for democratic climate politics, is it? But I think actually that those 70 million votes help to prove my point, because they show us that we need more democracy and better democracy rather than no democracy at all. Because amongst those 70 million, of course, there will have been some who agree with him about the science. But for most of them, it just didn't influence their vote. It just somehow didn't cut through day-to-day life, the concerns that they had. They had other priorities. But I have no doubt, and all the evidence of deliberative processes, which I'll go on to talk about, all the evidence of deliberative processes supports this, that if given the respect, the responsibility, the access to information and evidence, the vast majority would support the action that we need to tackle the climate emergency. And no one, or maybe I should say vanishingly small numbers of people, are deliberately voting for 3 or 4 degrees of warming and the destruction of the natural world. So I think that question of the 70 million should be seen not as a failure of public morals somehow, but a failure of our democratic systems and a shortcoming in the way that so far we've handled the climate crisis in politics. So I've made the case that we need more and better democracy. What might this look like? I'm just going to give you three sort of headline ingredients and won't go into the policy detail, though I'd be really happy to talk through what that might mean in terms of the kinds of policies and approaches that we might want to see happening. So the three ingredients are, firstly, narrative, a good story. You always need a good story. The second is much better citizen engagement. And the third is a sort of unrelenting honesty about the changes needed. So let's look at narrative first. We need to tell a good story. What story is that? Well, that's up for debate, but it needs two ingredients. It needs to be very upfront about the significance of the climate crisis. It shouldn't mince words about that. And, again, this research with politicians that I did showed that at the moment, they are pulling their punches about climate. They're very reluctant to really acknowledge the enormity of the climate crisis. And it actually resulted, when I was doing these interviews with MPs, it actually resulted in quite awkward moments. I remember one saying, God, yeah, I'm really worried about climate change. Right here where we're sitting in the House of Commons, this might be underwater in a matter of decades. And yet somehow they wouldn't dwell on that. They sort of suddenly moved on to talking about, electoral reform or what was happening next week or something. They find it really hard to dwell on the significance of the climate crisis. But I think we have to face up to that if we're going to be able to tell a story. So we need to be upfront about the problem, but we also need to be really upbeat about the solution. We need to be able to tell a story of transformation. So how acting on climate is both necessary and desirable, and how it links to our other priorities as a society: jobs, health, fundamentally well-being. And a good example of this, I think, is the Green New Deal in the US. And it's interesting to see how, with the horrors of Trump in the White House, that actually gave the Democratic Party in the US a little bit of sort of time out to think about who they were as a party. And you saw this, really energizing debate between different aspects of the Republican Party, with those, really impressive young Democrats coming through and really arguing for the Green New Deal. And if you read the original Green New Deal proposal, that the bill that was put forward, I mean, it's crazily idealistic. It has a really sort of strong political flavour that not everyone will like. I mean, within the Green New Deal proposal, there's even universal healthcare, which for US is a big deal, right? It's sort of marrying climate change and social justice in a way that hadn't happened in a mainstream political party before. So it's hugely idealistic. And in a way, that's the whole point of it. It's saying this is who we are as a democratic, as the Democrats. This is the kind of vision that we have, and climate is front and centre of that vision for a more just society. So that is a story. The left would tell you that is the story. But I don't think that's true. How brilliant would it be if we had competing political stories? If all politicians were, did that first thing about being open about the significance of climate change, but then had competing stories, competing political narratives about how you get there. Yet what I've seen on the right is that, in the UK at least, the political right have pledged their support time and time again for strong carbon targets. It was Theresa May who introduced the net zero target last year. Boris Johnson chose to speak about it the morning after he was elected, just over a year ago now, just under a year, I can't remember. So, they've really time and time again affirmed their commitment to the target and to the Climate Change Act, which is great. But I don't think that they have yet articulated a narrative, one that reaches out to voters for their story of transformation. And I think that's a really urgent job now on the right. And it's tantalising because in what Boris Johnson announced in terms of the 10-point plan and so on, you can maybe see sort of little scraps of that narrative emerging. It's around, very sort of techno-optimistic vision. It's around, jobs and skills around the UK, the sort of link to levelling up and so on. You can see it being pieced together, but it's not yet that confident narrative that they need. So that was my first ingredient, narrative, telling a good story. The second is engagement. So how we get a proper dialogue going between citizen and state, between citizen and government on how we reach our climate goals. So it's really important to realise here that, we, myself, and I'm sure many of you who've come along today are experts on decarbonisation, but we're not experts in people's lives. So when we think about policies for, transport, food, heating our homes, whatever that might be, we should absolutely recognise that people have expertise in their own lives, and we should have the humility to ask people to work with us. And this is a two-way street. It's not just the phrase I often hear, taking the public along with us. It's not them, leaping on our zero carbon train. It's actually a dialogue between citizen and state to design climate action that really works for people, that fits in with people's lives, and crucially fits in with people's aspirations. So how do we do this engagement? Well, I mean, there's a very strong tradition of thinking about deliberative democracy, and deliberative democracy differs from representative democracy in that it really foregrounds the citizen-state relationship, and it places a lot of evidence on having informed citizens and having well-respected citizens, and on really opening out the democratic process beyond just voting. So you might say that voting in elections is necessary but not sufficient. And one vital ingredient, not the whole picture, but one vital ingredient is individual deliberative processes like Climate Assembly UK. So this is this incredible experiment that I was part of this year, and it's one of the most amazing things I've done in my career, I think. It was just really brilliant to see it in action. So Climate Assembly UK was a gathering of 108 UK citizens selected to be representative of their country as a whole in terms of age, where they come from geographically in the UK, socioeconomic background, gender, ethnicity, and attitude to climate change. So the 108 in the room mirrored the levels of concern about climate change, and there was that was tested against a poll that's asked every year about how concerned are you about climate change. So we had a proper representative spread. It was like the UK in miniature, and it's a real heart-stopping moment when you walk into that room in Birmingham and see your country sort of set out before you in the form of 108 people who are going to help you do your job. And that was really really a moment for me. So these 108 citizens, originally it was supposed to be over 4 weekends, heard evidence on climate. They deliberated on possible solutions. They deliberated with experts and with each others, and then they published their recommendations to Parliament, and that happened in September. So it was supposed to be 4 weekends, but it ended up being 3 weekends in Birmingham, and then 3 shorter weekends in online sessions on the most enormous Zoom calls you'd imagine when COVID hit. And because COVID hit halfway through, we also talked to participants about the links between COVID recovery and achieving the net zero target. And those discussions were absolutely fascinating. So you might have seen the press headlines from the Climate Assembly, and they tended to focus on the sort of most eye-watering recommendation, or eye-catching, sorry, I should say, maybe eye-watering recommendations like a frequent flyer levy or banning cars from town centres. But for me, those weren't the main findings. There are some core themes that come up time and time again in the citizens' discussions and recommendations. Time and again, they talked about this need for information and education and dialogue. And the way they tended to phrase it was that their eyes had really been opened by coming along to the Climate Assembly, and having been part of it, they couldn't believe that this debate wasn't happening more widely in society and in our political system. And so they wanted, the debates that had been happening amongst the 108 within the Citizens' Assembly, within that hotel in Birmingham, to spread far and wide, and for people to be involved in a much more systematic way. They also, another principle that came up time and time again was that of fairness. And this is defined a bit differently by different people, and it tends to match to political views, but everyone has a conception of fairness. And it was really important that the ways that we get to net zero are seen as fair between regions, fair across income levels, different sectors of the economy, and fair in terms of people's own sort of values and outlooks. Obviously, there was a lot of talk about taking advantage of what you might call co-benefits, economic benefits that might be for local high streets, for health, and for well-being. And they also really wanted to see strong leadership from government. Interestingly, they wanted a cross-party approach as well. They wanted that sort of narrative to be shared across the political divide. And another thing that came out quite a lot was a focus on the local. So, for example, in the group that I looked after, who were looking at energy use in the home, they wanted locally driven solutions, maybe managed by local authorities or by local organisations. And that's actually a big change from the way we've been doing policy to date. So what processes like, what the Climate Assembly taught me is that processes like this can be used not to replace representative democracy, but to improve the way it works. Because a vote is a really blunt instrument. It's a very limited way of telling politicians what sort of a world you want to live in. And it's not just Climate Assembly UK, there have now been quite a few local initiatives. Citizens' juries, which are like the Assembly but on a smaller scale, have happened in Leeds, Lancaster, my own hometown of Kendal, Oxford, Camden. There's been too many to count now. But there is, of course, a crucial issue of how the results of these processes are used. And that's why, I mean, just today, many of you may have seen the Climate Change Committee launched their latest report to Parliament and government. And they incorporated the findings of Climate Assembly UK into all their findings. It informed the scenarios that they developed. And it was just brilliant to see these citizen views and the recommendations from Climate Assembly being used in this way, and all credit to the committee for doing that. And it was interesting because Chris Stark, who is Chief Exec of the Climate Change Committee, was alongside me one of the 4 expert leads on the Climate Assembly. And he openly admits, he said so this morning at the launch of his report, that he hadn't been convinced about the Climate Assembly, that he was, worried about how, everyday citizens might approach these problems, that, maybe that it might be sort of, the findings might be sort of a bit wacky or eccentric. And he was, he was open to persuasion, but he had his doubts. And he was completely convinced, having seen it in action, as most people are if they see these deliberative processes in action. And what he said was that, we took 108 people through this process. It was a very, very different process to the one that the committee goes about to develop its recommendations. So the citizens were, it was a very much sort of bottom-up qualitative discursive route. And the committee, the Climate Change Committee, as you'll imagine, are very into sort of, top-down, expert-led modelling and so on. And yet they actually ended up in a really similar place. And so the Climate Change Committee are really firmly behind this approach now. And that's brilliant to see. And I think the next stage is to see deliberation, not necessarily huge climate assemblies, but ways of doing deliberation, ways of getting that citizen engagement built into our democratic processes as an inbuilt requirement. And I'm now, the fellowship I hold now is I'll be working with the Climate Change Committee and others about what this might look like, what it might look like to embed deliberation in our system of climate politics. So my last ingredient to more and better democracy is an honesty about what we actually need to face up to if we're going to do good climate politics. Because I think there's been a tendency to talk about the good stuff, like, you know, more renewable energy, and that's fantastic. You know, collapsing prices of solar, that's you know, it's been that's really great. But we find it hard to talk about what we need to do less of. And we find it hard to talk about the fact that, you know, the science is unequivocal. Oil and gas and coal needs to stay in the ground. That's not a, you know, that's a campaigner's slogan, but it's actually the best summary that we have of the scientific evidence on this. And the reason that we haven't had that honest conversation is because of really problematic power relations. There's very good evidence amassed that that incumbent companies and industries have undue influence over politics, and their lobbying strategies, often very deliberate, are well documented. You know, you look at the case of Exxon, for example, it goes back 40 years at least. And this matters for climate because, as you'll know, we need a rapid transition away from the status quo. And this means changes to the economy. And so the companies of the future, those who stand to prosper in a net zero world, by definition, as companies of the future, don't have as loud a voice as the companies whose very reason for existence might be threatened, like the oil and gas companies and airlines, for example. And I've seen this unfold in front of me here in Cumbria because Australian venture capitalists are putting forward a plan for a coal mine, which, if it goes ahead, would be responsible for 9 million tonnes of emissions a year. That's the same as Belfast, Edinburgh and Cardiff. And we're tying ourselves in knots trying to work out whether or not this coal mine is actually legal because of the ambiguous policy, because we haven't faced up to, with the required level of honesty, to the fact that we need to phase out fossil fuels and we shouldn't do any more investment in high carbon infrastructure or fossil fuel extraction. But our policy is still very ambiguous. We haven't had that honest conversation about the changes needed. And that's why Nicola Sturgeon can get away with discussions about, she actually says, a net zero North Sea oil and gas basin actually uses the term net zero to apply to oil and gas production. And that's not honest. So we need much more honesty and transparency, both about regulation and also about where the money flows and where the lobbying happens. I think that's happened a lot more in the financial world with the discussions about transparency and disclosure, but we really need to drag that into the political world. So I just want to finish on a personal note, because I think it's really important to acknowledge that the climate crisis is something that affects us all personally as well as professionally, and you know that it is about emotion as well as sort of rational talk of solutions. And most of you who've come along today, if you've, you know, by definition, if you've come along to a talk like this, you're already thinking a lot about climate. So you're already not representative, actually, of the wider population. So I want to suggest, as I finish, that you should be thinking about two things, and they may seem in conflict, but on second glance they fit together really well. The first thing is, I think it's incumbent on all of us to do all you can to push climate action forward. Talk about it. Don't keep silent. Talk to your MP. If you want to see your MP, there's a brilliant charity called Hope for the Future who provide you with all the practical resources and tips you might want about talking to politicians. Talk to your MP. Protest. Remember, the least likely you are to protest, the sort of less of a usual protest suspect you are, the more that politicians will listen to you. And most importantly, in terms of your own climate action, we should be listening. And that listening is a link to the second thing I want you to do, which is to understand that people have very different motivations and starting points and values and priorities in life. And so we absolutely mustn't dismiss those 70 million who voted for Trump, those people who don't see climate as a priority. To tackle the climate crisis, we'll need to get nearly everyone on board, at least in a passive sense. And building a climate strategy with wide appeal is really, really crucial. And that, I think, is where listening comes in. And the situation we're in right now, in the midst of, and hopefully beginning to emerge from, a global pandemic, makes this all the more crucial. Because as we start to, think about recovering from COVID, it's really clear that the opportunity for a climate-focused recovery is there for the taking. But just because that climate-focused recovery is necessary, just because we have the evidence that it needs to be done, doesn't mean it will happen. If we want it to happen, we need to have this agreed through our democratic process, and we need people's support. So above all, this is a story that has yet to be written, but it's a absolutely crucial story to be part of. So I'll leave it there, but I'd be really interested to hear your views on that. And if you want to get into some of the policy specifics, then I'm happy to do that as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I thought that was really fascinating. And as we sort of mentioned before, Rebecca has a new book out, which goes into sort of a lot more detail on lots of the stuff that's been talked about today. It's called Too Hot to Handle. I think Patrick will put some links to where that's available in the chat. I actually finished reading it this morning. It's really great. I really found it very challenging, and quite challenging in the sense that it kind of opened my eyes to things that I'd previously maybe had as sort of lazy assumptions about some of these things. And it left me both thinking that I had a broader understanding of the scale of the problem, but also a better understanding of how, following some of the approaches that Rebecca describes, we might actually be able to find a way out of the mess that we're in. So it's a very optimistic book as well, which I really appreciated. Because
thank you, Ben. I'll put you on the cover of the second edition.
Great, well, perfect. Well, again, thank you very much for that talk. It's brilliant. I think we have a few questions from the chat, so we'll move on now to the Q&A session. The first question we have is from Emma Burns, who's a PhD student here at Imperial, and it's on the influence of private corporations. Emma, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, so you did then go on to talk about it later on in the talk, but the influence that corporations have, particularly oil and gas companies, and the reason that America doesn't have a good public rail network is because of car lobbyists saying, no, you need to buy our products. But then as well, the flip side, so how much influence do new green companies have? So I've recently discovered, a couple of websites where I can buy things like clothes that are all ethically made, but I had to look for them. I couldn't find them. So I don't know, what kind of influence does the private sector have on the public sector in terms of like policy and public opinion?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I mean, it's a really crucial point, and I think that cracking this one is partly about process, and it's partly about culture, effectively. So in terms of process, I think that there's a lot could be done. I mean, ironically, the reason it hasn't happened is because of the role of those companies. But I think that we need much more transparency, even who's getting meetings with ministers, who's being seconded in and out of government, what money is flowing where. And I think there should be a presumption to openness and transparency on all of those issues. I also think that in terms of culture, I think that, this is a difficult issue to talk about amongst the policymaking community, but all of us are influenced by the status quo. We take the status quo as our starting point. And there are powerful high carbon interests who make up our, who make up our understanding of that status quo. So we're all sort of a little bit influenced by them. And I find this, and maybe you do as well, when you're in meetings with people who, are from BP or ex-BP or, who are representing high carbon interests, it's really difficult to have that honest conversation. And actually, the big companies like the oil and gas majors are very adept at getting onto advisory committees. They're very adept at influencing the process in the politest ways, often. And so it is really hard to step back and say, actually, you shouldn't be making a profit out of oil anymore. You just shouldn't. And it's something that I've managed to do only really recently, and I think that's telling. So I think there's a real culture shift needed about that, and at the very least we should have that transparency. But I think all of us working in this field need to think really carefully about what money is backing what positions, and I think that the policymaking process should actually try to find ways, and that there are ways of privileging voices from smaller companies that either don't exist yet or aren't dominant yet, because we need to hear from those innovators. We need to hear from the net zero companies sort of leading the charge in order to get things right for them and other companies like them to prosper.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Emma, and that really interesting answer, Rebecca. Right, so thank you. So the next question is from Sarah Kakadellis, and it's about the Chinese approach and how that compares to the more democratic approach you're advocating here.
Thanks. I don't know, shall I just answer it straight, or does Sarah want to come in?
I don't know if Sarah's here. I'll read it out quickly then.
Yeah,
Sarah's here.
So yeah, I was just wondering, because you mentioned the Trump administration, but obviously we have there's also China to look at, and arguably not necessarily the most democratic approach, but perhaps still quite impactful when it comes to delivering on climate targets as fast as we can. So I was wondering if what your thoughts were on that top-down approach, and if there's actually something we could learn as well and translate it into a pro-democracy debate. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's often wheeled out, isn't it, that the Chinese state can just get on with this business of decarbonisation without having to worry what people think about it. I mean, let's leave aside for a moment the moral issues about that, because there are, plenty of other reasons to argue for democracy. But let's leave that aside for a moment. You could say, if it gets the job done, we could hold our noses about that. I don't say that, but one could say we could hold our noses on the moral question if it delivers the goods. So I'm emphatically not a China expert, but I've had conversations with colleagues at Lancaster actually who have studied this, and I think the important thing to think is that any government, whether or not it has a representative democratic system in place, every government needs some form of consent from its citizens. Right, and the Chinese state need that just as much as anyone. They need at least passive support from at least a decent majority of their people for their program, and that's why they've gone headlong over the past 30 years for maximum economic growth, because the sort of implicit pact between citizens and the state in China has been about economic liberalisation, which benefits most but not all citizens, and that's almost a kind of tacit agreement that they will they'll get that economic growth, they'll get increased economic well-being, as long as they don't sort of agitate too much for political freedoms. But over the past sort of 5 years, particularly around air quality, actually that environmental protection has been built into that sort of implicit contract between citizens and state. And it was air pollution that drove that, actually, not climate. But that has allowed the Chinese leaders to sort of extend that to carbon, and they may as well get away with it. But what it emphatically doesn't mean is that governments, even in authoritarian regimes, can just do what they feel like and, you know, wave a magic wand and make it happen. So I think even in China, it's a lot more complicated than you might think.
Thank you. It's really interesting.
Great, thank you for that question. The third question we've got is from Richard Belcher, who's also a PhD student here at Imperial. Richard, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was just wondering really what your thoughts are on how politicians might, you know, respond to these kind of citizens' assemblies, and if they could, you know, they might try and sort of playing them down for other reasons, because it kind of in a way is weakening their like political position, I suppose, their sort of power they have. If you have any experience with that or any thoughts on that as an issue.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's one I've encountered, I wouldn't say quite a bit, but it does crop up in conversations with MPs. And I know that when we were designing the Climate Assembly, so the Climate Assembly was established by 6 select committees in Parliament, and that's a lot of MPs. I mean, there's at least sort of, I don't know, between 10 and 20 on each select committee, so it's a decent chunk of them. And some of them were sceptical because they said, why do we need a citizens' assembly? This Parliament is the citizens' assembly. And I think that they're absolutely right that in a representative democracy, MPs as representatives are the ones who have to, in the end, take decisions in the national interest. That is their job, right? And so I am actually quite opposed to to those people who argue, and Extinction Rebellion sometimes argue this, although it's a bit ambiguous. They sometimes argue that they want a citizens' assembly instead of the House of Commons. And I don't agree with that at all, because I think that, you know, as Winston Churchill said, representative democracy parliamentary democracy is the worst system that we have except for all the others. You know, I think that representative democracy in the form of, you know, in our case, Parliament, is about as good as you know, as good a system as we can hope for, and we don't want to replace it by a whole different system altogether. But what you can get through something like a climate assembly is a much more nuanced idea of what citizens think and their views and values on a particular subject. So the way that we've tended to sell it to MPs is actually that they are the ultimate decision makers, but then when they make those decisions, they should be as well informed as they can be. And so processes like Climate Assembly UK are, you know, a form of gathering of social intelligence, if you like. And so they can make their decisions much better informed. So I think, I mean, reading your question, I would like politicians to lead. I think they need to go beyond mediation. They do need to lead, and in a climate crisis, they need to lead more than ever, because they need to be the ones that are saying, we've got to crack this, we've got to tackle the climate emergency. But then I would like a little bit of humility about the strategies that are used and the approaches that are used, and I would like them to be learning from people, about people's lives, about their views and values, and how that can fit into how we tackle the climate emergency.
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. We next have a question from Krista, who's also a PhD student here at Imperial. Krista, would you like to read out your question?
Sure. Thanks so much for the talk. It's been really interesting. This is quite related to what was already talked about in terms of the big companies, but I was just wondering about media, and slightly cynically, while obviously we'd like to have a lot more deliberative democracy, is it quite difficult in a system where the media is often controlled by quite strong vested interests? And I just wanted to hear what your thoughts on this are. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, again, let me. I'm keen to sort of delineate my expertise. I'm not an expert on the media. I think James Painter at Oxford is the huge expert on climate in the media. But I do tend, as you suggested, I do tend to sort of put them in the same box as vested interest, in that we need a lot more transparency about why they're saying what they're saying, who's paying them, and so on and so forth. I think there's some specific issues, which obviously the BBC's been grappling with around, false balance, which is where you put a climate scientist to get up against a climate change denier. I think, the BBC's tackled that. Some of our newspapers obviously haven't, and I think that should just be called out. I think that's, absolutely appalling. I think that the real issue here is that the media are exaggerating the level of skepticism about climate, and they are definitely exaggerating opposition to climate policies. And it's interesting because the same is happening over COVID. You might think that everyone is now, breaking lockdown left, right and centre, but that isn't actually true. The media really highlight individual cases of lockdown breaking, Rita Ora's party or whatever that might be. But actually, most people are still complying a lot more than behavioural scientists thought they would, actually. And I think there's a similar thing going on with climate. I mean, there's huge levels of public concern for climate. And yet we see the media reporting the sort of backlash against things like low traffic neighbourhoods. And there's a good story in there, right? And they do that partly because of who they're backed by and where the money is.
Great, thank you very much. That's brilliant. So we next have a question from Jarmo, who is also a PhD student here at Imperial. Jarmo, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for the talk. And most of this, I think, has already been answered. But basically, sort of from a strategic point of view, how would you suggest we could do to perhaps convince our local MPs to support more deliberative democracy? And this of course holds for climate change, but perhaps also for other issues. Is there a clear story, a convincing story that you found that we can tell them to make them sway and maybe also advocate for this themselves?
Yeah, thanks, Jarmo. And I think that it's a case of seeing is believing, I think, for this. And I'm aware sometimes when I talk about, so I've been involved in these processes a long time. I mean, I remember, I think 15 years ago was the first one I did, which was I was involved in a citizens' jury on nanotechnology. And we took, I think, 10 or 20 citizens from Halifax, a town in the north of England. And over a series of evenings, they actually developed a really practical and sophisticated set of recommendations for how government could regulate something that is too small to see, and they managed it. And it was brilliant to see how they did it. And there's something this is why I sound evangelical about it, because there's something very magical about seeing that happen and about realizing people's capacity to act as citizens, to think through really tricky issues, to handle incredibly complex information, to work with each other, help each other out and come to a sensible solution. I've never seen a process that doesn't do that. So for Climate Assembly UK, we were really keen to get MPs along. I think we had sort of 5 or 10 MPs came to Birmingham and saw it in action. We had more coming to speak to the citizens. We've had members of Climate Assembly UK presenting the recommendations back to Parliament and so on. And I honestly think that when you see these processes in action, as I mentioned with the Committee on Climate Change, you think, it's not the only thing we need, but it's a really good way of developing much better social intelligence about what our climate strategy could look like.
Great, that's a really interesting question. Thank you very much for that. I think so. Next, we have a question from Ariella, who is a master's student here at Imperial. Ariella, would you like to ask a question in person?
Thank you. So thank you, Rebecca. It was really interesting. I would like to hear more maybe about what are your thoughts regarding how to scale this up, both in terms of reaching more citizens and also maybe it having more of an impact if it would reach more people, processes like the Citizens Assembly.
Yeah, thanks, Ariella. I mean, I think, there are plans being put in place for a global Citizens Assembly on climate, which are absolutely mind-blowing. And actually, if you look at them, I can't remember the URL, I'll try and find it, but they aren't even using nation states. So they're not taking, a number of citizens from each nation state. They're actually, using different geographical regions and bringing together literally a panel of global citizens, which I find mind-blowing. The issue with that is how does that then feed in, obviously, to the legislative process in each country. But anyway, you can do this at whatever scale. I'm actually more interested in sort of the other end of the scale, how you build in, as you mentioned, deliberation into policy processes. And once you start thinking this way, it seems really strange that doesn't happen. So, if you're, when Unilever is developing a new brand of shampoo or something, it focus groups that to the hill, right? And make sure that this is the kind of shampoo that people want to buy, that it's, that it's aspirational, that it looks good in people's showers, whatever that might be. And that's a really trivial example, but actually government doesn't do that with policies. Right, it does do social research, but the way that government gets input into its policies is through this 6-week consultation period, when who piles in? The lobby groups, the green groups, which is fine, but they have a particular view as well. It's basically a discussion between experts, and of course you can add in opinion polling, but opinion polls don't have that vital first section about informing citizens, giving them the information they need in order to make the decision. So, sure, you can phone someone up and say, what do you think about carbon capture? But you're not going to get a very sensible answer. If you're developing policy on carbon capture and you talk to citizens about what it is and what they think about it, then that is a really essential way in. I have a little sneaking suspicion that one of the reasons that hasn't happened is because citizens tend to say things that are difficult for government. So in the case of carbon capture, actually in the Climate Assembly, they said they were really suspicious about it because they saw it as a sort of get out of jail free card. They thought that if government encouraged carbon capture, then companies or individuals or whoever wouldn't want to do the sort of basic carbon reduction stuff. And I think, fair point. And that's something that comes out of public discussions. And so it's quite challenging for governments. But, we need challenge on this, right? We really need to step up a gear on climate policy making. So I think any way you can of fitting it into the policymaking process. And that's what I'm now looking at, really practical examples of, okay, so if we're developing plans to retrofit 25 million houses or homes, how can we have those properly shaped by, how can we have those plans properly shaped by the people who live in those homes they're going to be retrofitted, that kind of thing.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Now, the next question is from Abigail Croker, but I have been asked to read it out because I think she's somewhere where she can't use her microphone. So the question is, how can deliberative democratic processes move parties away from constantly seeking the median position on the political spectrum so we can achieve radical climate action?
Yeah, if you know the answer to that, please tell me. I suppose the challenge is that the science is non-negotiable, right? We've got to control. We've got to get greenhouse gas emissions under control, and I think that part of it is well understood now by politicians. But I think that, as you say, there's still a sort of rush toward the centre ground, what's seen as the centre ground. I mean, I just think that my hope is that we stop seeing the centre ground as how much do we reduce greenhouse gases, that the centre ground stops being an argument about targets and actually more becomes an argument about the ways in which we meet those targets. And, if we have, the very radical sort of green left, Green New Deal stuff on the one hand, I would hope that, that was supplemented by a sort of centre ground left or right argument, which still achieved those climate targets, but maybe didn't also shoot for the moon in terms of social justice or whatever that might be. Sorry, that sounds a bit flippant, but what I'm trying to say is that the argument should be about policies to achieve those targets rather than the targets themselves. And I actually think we're there on that in the UK. I think there's real ambition behind this, but I worry that they don't know what they've signed up for in terms of those targets. I don't know that was an answer exactly, but I don't really have one.
Thank you, and thanks for the question, Abby. So next we have a question from Gina Charnley. Gina, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, thanks, Rebecca. That was a really interesting talk. As the question was, climate science has become really political, especially compared to other sort of climate science sort of issues. I use medicine for an example. Like, we know obesity is a huge problem, but there's science there. It's undeniable that it's an issue. It requires people to change their behavior. It requires government policy, but it's not become sort of aligned with a political end of the spectrum. Like, I feel like people on the political left and on the political right all agree obesity is a bad thing. Let's do something about it. And I was wondering if you agree that there has been this leftization, that's definitely not a word, but I'm going to use it, of sort of like climate science. And it's sort of like this view that it's sort of a left-wing issue. And so then anyone that identifies as being right-wing will just not agree with it because they're right-wing, and they just won't even look at the science because it's not their political leaning. I guess, do you think this is a big issue? And if so, how do you try and, change something like that?
Yeah, so I think leftization, as I think you said, might become a problem if the right don't get their act together soon. I mean, I find it problematic when those on the left say that you categorically and objectively cannot tackle climate change unless that goes hand in hand with really quite radical measures around social justice. Because, we know that half the population roughly in this country, probably about the same in the US, maybe slightly lower in Europe, are essentially right-wing voters. And so I think the right should kick back really strongly against that and say, excuse me, the right can do climate action as well, and this is what it should look like. But they haven't really come forward with that yet. I mean, they have to. And to a certain extent, that debate is now happening within the Conservative Party. If you look at, for example, the Conservative Environment Network, it's happening. So I think there is a danger. But actually, it is still to play for, because if you look at the evidence on this, there is widespread concern about climate change, even in the US. And the interesting thing is, in the US, even though it's only about half the population who believe, that's not the right word, but who believe in anthropogenic climate change, there are much higher levels of support for climate action. If you look at levels of support for renewables rollout, even with things like, Biden's policy of no fossil fuel extraction on public land, that kind of thing, there's actually pretty wide support for those measures amongst Republicans as well as Democrats. So it's all to play for on the right, I think.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for that question. I find that very encouraging. I look forward to hearing what the people on the right kind of can come up with. Great, so the next question is from Caitlin Hinson, who's also a PhD student at Imperial. Would you like to ask your question, please?
Thank you. So I'm really interested in what you were saying about the Climate Assembly and the fact that it is a representative sample of the UK population. And now representation and diversity is something we really struggle with in the environmental sector. And I've really noticed this in my own research. I work with catchment partnerships at quite a local scale. So groups of organisations, that various citizen groups and other environmental NGOs. And so I'm really interested in if you found it difficult to achieve that representation at the kind of national citizen assembly level. And also if you have any recommendations on how we can scale this down to work at a more local level for policy engagement.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a crucial point, and I really agree with you. I mean, in terms of formal processes like citizens' assemblies, I mean, if you're looking at a deliberative process like a citizens' assembly or citizens' jury, you know, the way it's done is that it has to be representative of the population as a whole. So for the National Climate Assembly, it was representative of the UK population. You know, if it's Leeds, like the Leeds Citizens Jury, it has to be representative of Leeds. And, you know, there are sampling techniques to make sure that that happens. It is always harder to recruit from the more excluded groups in terms of socio-economic background and in terms of ethnicity to a certain extent. And so how Climate Assembly dealt with that is they sent more invites to people in certain postcodes. So they sent out 30,000 invites to get 108 people, and they sent a lot more to the specified postcodes. And so they did get a proper balance. I think that some participation experts will tell you that it's good practice to actually over recruit for people who are, you know, people from marginalised groups, because, you know, for example, if you're talking about people with a disability, then if you are, you know, the one of only, you know, a very small number of people with a disability, then it puts you in a very difficult position in those discussions. So you can over sample for groups that might be excluded. And I think that is a good idea. We didn't do it in the national one because we wanted it to be sort of perfectly representative, but I think that's a good idea. In terms of local processes like the ones you're involved in, which sound really interesting, I think, you know, it's like all these people, you know, it's partly because the climate community self-defines, and I think at local areas, I mean, you know, everyone will know this from their own lives. I mean, you know, if I look at the rest of my life, the non-climate bit of it, you know, my kids are in football clubs, I'm sort of part of a school community, there's, you know, there's neighborhood groups and so on and so forth. There are ways of connecting with people, right? And I think we could do a lot more to reach out to those groups on a more informal basis.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the question and for that answer. We have another question now from Geraint Northwood. Geraint, would you like to ask your question, please?
Hi, yeah, I hope you can hear me. Thanks for the talk. It's been brilliant so far. I basically want to say, so, you know, there are some people who would argue that Donald Trump and other populists and stuff have been elected because of the failure of our democracies, you know, that we aren't being represented properly. And then you have, say, our workplaces, which are essentially usually democracy-free zones. And it strikes me that we wouldn't have ended up in this situation in the first place if we had democracy to begin with, sort of throughout our society. So my question is, you know, are there ways that we can begin to embed a deliberative democracy into our workplaces, into our representative democracy, you know, in advance of the next crisis?
Yeah, I mean, yes is the short answer. I'm just struggling because there was something announced this morning. And I can't remember. It wasn't climate. It was something else, and they proposed a national assembly about it. That's going to really wind me up now. If anyone remembers, put it in the chat. But I think there is more take up of these issues now. And I think you're right that, you know, when we see such huge problems with with democracy, that's when we tend to reach for more far-reaching solutions like greater deliberation. And yeah, you can totally do it in the workplace. I mean, I've been part. Well, maybe. I mean, I'd like to hear Lily's question direct, but it's part of the process that I've been involved in Lancaster University about Lancaster declaring a climate emergency and looking really comprehensively about how it can reduce to net zero its greenhouse gas emissions. And that wasn't as sort of deliberative a process as I'd like, but I think you really can do that at within any community, whether that be a university or a company. And for the same reason that you get really good social intelligence by speaking to all aspects, whether that be, undergraduates, people who work for the university in a professional capacity, everyone on campus, all have really genuinely useful, practical experience to add into that discussion.
Sorry, go ahead.
So yeah, I sort of meant how do we enforce that process as citizens and as members of companies and stuff, because I don't know if you've had experience or not necessarily forcing, but encouraging the democratization in a deliberative way of places that might be resistant to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can do it without you can do it without the blessing of those in charge. In fact, all last year, I was working with a group to put together a climate assembly for the UK before Parliament agreed to do it. And when Parliament agreed, we sort of swerved our plans, but we were going to do it without them, right? But then you have the problem of how you use the findings, and you then, you run the process, and then you sort of almost go into campaign mode about, this is what needs to happen. But there's no reason why you can't just, follow the principles and set it up. But it is better if it's done as a sort of official process. And I think it goes back to what I was saying about seeing is believing, seeing where it's happened elsewhere, seeing how transformative it is, both for the people who are part of that process and also for the people sort of receiving that advice. I think it's really worth trying to like for the climate assembly, there's quite a lot of footage of different assembly members that follows their sort of background and says a bit about their lives and then why they're involved. Those kind of personal stories, I think, really help to communicate why this is such a good idea.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think we've got one more question then. That's from Lily. I wonder if she'd like to ask it directly.
Hi, yeah, thanks for a really interesting talk. You say in it, which I agree, a point which I agree with, that you don't think it should be possible to benefit from oil and gas going forward. And so I would just be interested on what your sort of thoughts are about universities like Imperial, which are across the country and the world, that have really prominent climate change research institutes and departments, but simultaneously are slow to or refuse to divest from fossil fuels and continue to massively profit from research into fossil fuel extraction.
Yeah, I mean, I would say don't do it. I think that, I mean, I find this really problematic. So I sat on the I sat on the board of NERC, the Natural Environment Research Council, and all this is minuted. While I was there, I asked for them to have a transparent policy. I wasn't asking them not to take money from oil and gas companies, right? I was saying that they should set out a policy about whether they take money from fossil fuel interests, and if so, what conditions are attached to that. And I was for every step of the way, and it didn't happen. And I find that inexcusable, because they're not giving money just philanthropically. They want something for it, right? And so I think we just need to face up to this. We need to be really honest about it. And Imperial's sort of top of the list for oil and gas funding, right? Oil and gas and money from fossil fuel companies. And I just think we need to be really upfront that can't happen. At the very least, it needs to be really clear, under what conditions that money's being accepted. But I'm fed up of it now. Sorry, that's not a very professional answer.
No, that's interesting. And just if I could ask one further thing. So do you think as students who are funded by NERC or any of the other research councils, we should be writing to them to request this rather than Imperial, because it's falling on deaf ears at Imperial? Yeah, no, do it. And actually, with hindsight, I wish I'd fought more strongly at NERC. I mean, that was a few years ago, and it's one of those real, like, I wish I'd done that. And the reason I didn't was exactly for the reason that politicians don't want to be labelled as a freak or a zealot. I wanted to be seen as a respectable, mainstream member of that committee. There was a lot else going on, but, I wanted to be a kind of grown-up player at the table. And so I pulled my punches, and I really regret that. And I'm just not doing that anymore. Great, thank you.
Thank you. Rebecca, I know we have to let you go pretty soon. We have just had one more question pop up in the chat. So if you're happy to answer, that would be brilliant. It's just very quickly, do you think there is enough time to improve democratic participation sufficiently in time to also meet our climate targets? And how do you think achieving more democracy in the UK will influence the wider global picture?
Sure. Well, I think it's a... So I don't really agree with the premise of that question, actually, because, I mean, do I think that we have to get democracy working perfectly before tackling climate change? No, because we'll be busting 4 degrees before we do that, right? So, in an ideal world, I would, I think that we really need reform of the House of Lords, for example. I think we need reform of the first past the post electoral system. I could go on. There's loads that would make climate politics work a lot better. But so I'm not waiting for all that to be perfect before we then decide we can sort of pick up and do climate. But I think this idea that you could do it quicker if you don't do it democratically is really wrong, because I think that will increase political polarisation. It will increase resentment towards government. We'll end up with a lot of policies that don't work very well because we haven't involved people in how we make them, and there will be a backlash. So, we've got to do these things hand in hand, I think, which is why, seeing what the Climate Change Committee came up with today in terms of the way they've built that social intelligence from the Climate Assembly into their advice to government, I think that is, really pragmatic and really encouraging that they're doing it that way.
Great, thanks very much for that question, Jo. And right, so that is the end of this section of the talk. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining us today. I thought it was a really fascinating talk, and actually I find it really exciting to hear about quite how productive these citizens' assemblies seem to be. I certainly hope at some point I'll be able to, in the future, I'd love to see one of them in action. They really do sound amazing. So thank you very much for that. Again, just the book, Too Hot to Handle, I really do recommend it to anyone. It's not.
There you go, here it is.
I would have brandished a copy, but I read it on my Kindle, so that wouldn't be quite so effective. So that's available through Amazon and Bristol University Press. A recording
of Imperial Library, I would hope.
Or Imperial Library, but yeah. You might prefer for us to buy it. Yeah.
No, as long as you read it, I don't care about the money bit.
Perfect. So thank you. Great. So a recording of everything that's gone on today will soon be on the Grantham website. Links to that will be provided through social media and the newsletter. So please do look out for those. Our next seminar will be in January. Full details will be announced shortly. So please keep an eye out on our social media channels again for all announcements. Again, we've got more seminars coming up next year. If anyone here has any suggestions for future speakers they'd love to hear, please do let us know, because we're always looking for new ideas. Rebecca will head off now, so thank you so much to her, and thank you all for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly have. I and my colleague Patrick, a few of the rest of us will stay on the chat for a few minutes if anyone wants to talk to us about the seminar or anything else, or just chat to each other. But otherwise, yeah, once again, thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining us. It's really been fantastic to hear you speak.
Well, thanks. Thanks for the invite. It's been a brilliant discussion. So yeah, you're always an amazing bunch at Imperial. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.